Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 14th of March 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Brian Gerrish. Mike Robinson.
Bit of a last-minute deal here, Brian.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Just-in-time delivery from the UK Column, all on a budget of less than 3.74 billion, which of course is the budget for the British Broadcasting Company, also the government's propaganda machine. Now, we're delighted to be joined by Vanessa Beeley, also David Ellis today. Where do we start?
Well, we're starting off with chemical weapons in eastern Ghouta. Vanessa, let's bring you straight in. Allegedly, a chemical weapons factory found in eastern Ghouta.
Yes, in the last, I think it was yesterday, the photos started to appear of what seemed to be a chemical weapons manufacturing site, but actually, and this is an interesting development, an analyst who's been working on the previous chemical weapon attacks and on the environment where those attacks happened, has made the point that one of the photos showed a flask connected to a pipe going through a wall. And the point that he's made, and this is right now it's speculative, but we've got journalists working on it that are on the ground in eastern Ghouta. And what he's basically said is this doesn't look like a chemical munitions factory. It actually looks more like a gas chamber with chemicals prepared on the side. Now, that's a pretty scary development there. But if you remember on the previous time I was on UK Column, I think I made the prediction that I felt very strongly that the US and the UK and its allies were clearly hiding something pretty major in eastern Ghouta, and that's why we've seen the media hysteria. I know we saw it in eastern Aleppo, but we now know there were a number of things that were being concealed by the terrorist occupation in East Aleppo, and I think now we're seeing the same thing again. You know, we're seeing the usual footage that we saw in East Aleppo. We'll come on to that later. But this is particularly disturbing. So this has just come through to me. We've passed it on to the journalists on the ground in eastern Ghouta for them to look into further, because they might not recognize that. They would have seen the chemical ingredients, of which there were a number. They would have seen the sort of the factory machines that were in there, but they wouldn't have necessarily made that connection to such a horrifying concept. If that is the case, and if they have been clearly potentially gassing hostages and civilians in that area, that is a pretty hideous development on this.
Well, it is indeed. Now, we're going to be talking about Russia and the Russian hysteria, the hysteria over Russia a little bit later. But Vanessa, one of the questions on our minds over the last number of months has been every time there's an alleged gas attack, has been the question of whether this has been gas released into the streets and in fact the question is, where did they get the bodies in many cases? But what we're talking about here, of course, is not a government-owned gas, whatever it is, it's gas of some kind, but it's... Yeah.
Well, yeah, and another point to make here, Mike, which you've actually just mentioned, is that during these chemical weapon attacks, when you speak to people on the ground in Syria, what they are saying, and they said particularly in the Eastern Ghouta attacks in 2013, Mother Agnes did a full report on that, where parents of children that had been previously kidnapped in a different area of Syria had been seen among the bodies in the Ghouta attacks. Now, what I've also heard, and I've had confirmed by people on the ground who have this information, that in the last few days, a number of civilians in the thousands, I'm told, have been moved into eastern Ghouta and held in the tunnels in the urban areas as hostages and as human shields. Now, again, until I get to Syria, I cannot 100% confirm these stories that I'm hearing, but they are coming from a very reliable source that has given me absolutely 100% reliable information over the last few years. So it sounds very much as the Syrian army is bearing down upon the remaining now 3 pockets of terrorist strongholds, because they've now divided eastern Ghouta into 3 islands, if you like, so that they can reduce down the unity of the terrorists and start to bring tighten the noose around them. We're seeing this definite defensive reaction from them, and of course a ramping up of the hysteria from the United States in particular, but also from the UK, who are talking about going against the UN and intervening militarily in Syria. So I think, as we predicted, we're seeing a clear closing in by the Syrian army and its allies into what has been hidden in eastern Ghouta for the last 5 years.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, I want to highlight this article on Sputnik, Sputnik News International, exclusive the violent reality of Western propaganda construct, White Helmets. Western media and politicians have venerated the work of the White Helmets in Syria. However, journalist Vanessa Beeley has uncovered troubling evidence by the group's true nature and affiliations. This is a fantastic summary of all the work that you've done over the last couple of years, Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Kit's done a great job. He took the time to talk to me and to go through a few questions with me. So congratulations to him on really an excellent, as you say, summary, which also includes the evidence from Marcello and the Swedish Doctors for Human Rights on the Samin alleged chlorine gas attacks. But I would also like to make the point there's a number of who shall remain unnamed, but activists and so-called pro or anti-imperialist activists and commentators who are ramping up the attempts to stop further investigation into the White Helmets. So, you know, we shouldn't be backing off on the White Helmets, because this organization has played a pivotal part in the maintaining of the conflict inside Syria. And I genuinely do believe it's not only going to be used in Syria, it's going to be used elsewhere. It may have a different name, very much as they rename the terrorist groups, they may rename the White Helmets, but this concept is going to be used again and again going forward.
Absolutely. Okay, look, we're going to move on, Vanessa, but if you're able to stay with us, please do, because I'm interested in getting your thoughts later on the Russian situation. But let's move on to back to the UK here. And David Gauke, the Justice Secretary, he is concerned about the number of children being groomed, apparently, in the Islamic State death cult, as he describes it. This is one of Britain's great challenges, and he's saying that society has got the right to say that there are some environments that are not safe, and that because of children growing up inside families that are allegedly turned extremist, that really more children need to be taken by the state as a result. A child brought up in an environment that leads them towards a belief in a death cult is not an environment that as a society we can condone. Society has got the right to say there are some environments that are not safe and take action accordingly. We have to be conscious of the manipulators. I'm not sure whether he was looking in a mirror when he said that, Brian.
Well, the death cult.
Yes.
Conservative death cult. Well, this is unbelievably dangerous stuff, Mike. We're seeing this mix of language. So what is extremism? What does that actually mean? We've had people who the government has classed as right-wing. What does that mean? Blocked from coming into the country. And now if you're some government label, definition, you're extreme, therefore you're going to have your children taken away. But of course, what do we know? What have we been pumping out for years now? The industrial scale abuse of children within the so-called British care system. So terrorist children, okay, they committed a crime. The children are punished by being taken away and put in a deliberately abusive system, which the British government is covering up the abuse of the children. This is 1984 with some horrific twist to it, Mike. I think we're seeing a fascist agenda coming out of the Conservative Party, Theresa May's party, and that fascist agenda is growing by the day, and I mean the word fascist.
Well, it doesn't end there, because we have today the release of the Integrated Community Strategy Green Paper. This is Sajid Javid, who has set out what he describes as an ambitious long-term plan of action to tackle the root causes of poor integration and create stronger, more united Britain. They're going to work with 5 what they're describing as integration areas, and that's Blackburn and Darwin, Bradford, Peterborough, Walsall and Waltham Forest. So they've released this green paper alongside £50 million, which is going to be committed over the next 2 years. They're seeking views on these bold proposals to boost English language skills. So in the first case, we've got children being taken away from families under the guise of those families being extremist. Now we have a guise of teaching more people that are coming into the country the English language. So what exactly are they doing? They're going to boost English language skills. They're going to increase economic opportunities, especially for women, apparently. And to do that, Job Centre Plus is going to trial new approaches to support people from some of the most isolated communities. They're going to ensure that every child receives an education, and this is one of the key points here, because this is a direct attack on homeschooling. Because what they're saying is it's important that children are taught in a safe environment and somewhere which does not teach views that undermine our shared values. Children may be at increased risk of emotional or physical abuse and exposure to views that encourage isolation, intolerance, and a lack of respect for, even hostility towards others. So you can't teach your children at home. They've got to be taught in schools where they're coming under the full prevent strategy and getting the full indoctrination.
Full indoctrination of state values, not what the real family values are, not what their parents is, values of the parents is. We're going to have state indoctrination. And sorry, might just add in here, and we haven't forgotten, of course, that several years ago, Common Purpose was tasked to go into the communities to do this sort of work. Over £400,000, I think, was the figure put forward, and the immigrant communities in particular were warning each other about the danger of that program. So it's pretty obvious what's going on.
Absolutely. They're going to teach respecting and promoting equal rights. They're going to build vibrant communities, apparently. Well, this is what Sajid Javid had to say. Britain can rightly claim to be one of the most successful, diverse societies in the world, but we cannot ignore the fact that too many parts of our country communities are divided, preventing people from taking full advantage of the opportunities that living in modern Britain offers. Successive governments have refused to deal with the integration challenges we face head on, preferring to let people muddle along and live isolated and separated lives. We'll put an end to this through our new strategy, which will create a country that works for everyone, whatever their background, wherever they come from. Integration challenges are not uniform throughout the country, with different areas and communities having varying needs. Now, this part of this has come out of a review by Dame Louise Casey, who was on BBC Radio 4 this morning, Brian. And of course, one of the points that she was making yet again is that this is not about immigrant communities necessarily. It's also about dealing with what she described as right-wing extremism. And this is a particularly dangerous aspect of this.
It's dangerous because it isn't defined. What we've got occurring is the government simply decides it doesn't like somebody for criticising the government. Because you criticise the British government, you are right-wing. Because you're right-wing, you're an extremist. Because we designated you an extremist, we're going to steal your children. This is fascism, and it's unfolding in front of our very eyes. I think we need some of the backbench MPs to wake up pretty quickly, because at the moment this is drifting over their heads. Right,
Brexit and devolution. Now, of course, this is Britain in blue here, United Kingdom rather in blue, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Brexit is all about keeping the UK together, so of course this is what they're doing, breaking it apart. And again, Theresa May was meeting with the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales, along with representatives from the Northern Ireland Civil Service, because of course Northern Ireland doesn't have a sitting assembly at the moment. They went to Downing Street for an update on Brexit negotiations, and particularly progress on Clause 11 of the EU withdrawal bill, which is all about returning powers coming back from the EU, going straight to the devolved governments instead of to Westminster. So this is going to be the United Kingdom, or the not so United Kingdom, in the not too distant future. So again, we see Brexit being used to drive through a policy which isn't being discussed.
This map is very good, Mike, because it simplifies things right down. But of course, the original objective was to break the country up. So you split it up along natural lines. So Scotland there, of course, stays as a nation state. Wales stays as a nation state. And then England was to be divided into those European regions. And if you remember how hard they pushed through that there should be European-type elected regional assemblies, but when they actually put out for people to say, do you want these assemblies? People said, no, we don't want them. What did the government then do? Carry on with the policy of regionalising the country. You regionalise it in order to divide people against each other. And then the city states and the mayors is to create local fiefdoms. This is to create the sort of corrupt power base at every level. It's very obvious to see it, particularly with hindsight.
Right. Sticking with Brexit for a second. EU needs Britain fury as Eurocrat claims UK is too small to defend itself after Brexit. This is in the Daily Express. And they're saying that Dr. Natalie Tocci, who is Special Advisor to the European Foreign Affairs Commissioner Federica Mogherini, told an audience in London that the UK needs to be involved in the new European Defence Force. The remarks come on a day when European Commissioner Jean-Claude Juncker appeared to threaten Britain in a speech in the European Parliament. But anyway, Dr. Tocci was speaking to the Royal United Services Institute, and she said there's a debate to be had in the UK about looking beyond what it does to actually what does it actually mean to take back control, because size matters, and the UK is a small country in the world. This is the aspect which so jarred the whole Brexit debate. In my view, a realisation of how small we all are, how small and decreasingly influential we will be, and only by acting together we can gain control. So I think there's a bit of soul searching to be done on both sides of the question. So a good time to bring David Ellis onto the programme. David, and maybe I'll hijack you slightly by asking the question, you know, we'll come on to the whole issue with Russia in a second, but how much of this this hysteria over Russia at the moment do you think is about driving us closer into unified military structures with Europe?
It's certainly part of the scene. As to how, whether that's a little or a lot, you know, that's for the public to decide. Me personally, I think it's got a big driving force in there because it's taking a lot of the media wind off into a perverse direction. So yeah, it's a bit like sort of Dustin Hoffman's film Wag the Dog, isn't it? At the moment, you know, we're just seeing a lot of this stage managing PR propaganda. They're not fooling the professional intelligence services anywhere, whether that be here or in other countries, because they obviously can see through all this. The gambit is just to throw off the voters and the electorate, and it's obviously washing out huge amounts of Brexit, very important Brexit sort of issues like military union, because obviously this is taking the air, it's taking the wind. So yeah, I mean, let's come on to what this lady from UC is talking about here. Sorry, Rusi. Defence force. She's using a very interesting term there, because going back to Brian there with Sajid David, we did a bit of work on this quite some time ago, because that is exactly the phrase Sajid David used some years ago at a Tory party fundraiser I attended. And senior naval officers there went absolutely berserk at this point, because in Britain we have Her Majesty's Armed Services. So we've come full circle with that, haven't we? So the cat's out the bag on that one. And it's not a defence force. What we're talking about is military union. So she won't even use the correct term of reference.
Yeah, David,
and this is the term of reference that can obviously make any Tory MP run for cover.
Yep. David, unfortunately, I'm not able to bring you the slide of the RUSI comment, but we'll just remind our audience that RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, is, of course, one of these famed think tanks that seems to be able to sit on the sidelines of proper democracy, proper politics in Westminster, where we should have our elected representatives working with the civil service to decide what our defence policy is. But no, RUSI sits on the side, pontificating, producing papers and telling us what our policy is going to be. And it's quite clear that RUSI, or as you've often described them, UC, i.e. putting the EU in front of it, this is a pro-European Union think tank, and they are desperate for Britain to be fully integrated into this unified EU military structure. I'm going to be a bit more pushy than you, unusually today, because I'm going to say it seems to me that a key part of ramping up the antagonism against Russia at the moment is to give them an excuse for this unified EU system. And of course, we've got to remember that in the background, our armed forces are literally being ripped to pieces. Nothing works. The ships don't work. We haven't got enough men and women to get those ships to sea. The submarine service is in a perilous state. We're short of aircraft spares. The British Army is being cut to the bone. So on one hand, we're saying the Russians are going to murder us in our beds. On the other hand, the military is being cut to pieces. There can be only one answer for that, because we needed, or they needed, Britain's military to be cut in order to then say, well, the only way we can survive is to join this unified European structure. I think the jigsaw pieces are fitting together very nicely now.
Yeah, it is. It's dovetailing perfectly, isn't it? You know, we've got Jacob Rees-Mogg there in this article in the Express. And it's very interesting because I've met Jacob a couple of times face to face. And we've had the sort of standard, 10 minutes of chit chat and then, right, okay, what do we want to talk about? And I want to be talking to you about EU military union. At which point he balked, refused to engage, and changed the subject and went off into the circle introducing other people. And I've gone back to him subsequent. This is a big issue. It needs to be dealt with. There are huge amounts of money and business interest here in the UK to be accounted for as to how we're going to manage our defence and defence industry and our military. And what do we have all going on at the same time in this defence scene? We have the likes of Lord Tebbit saying, from within his quorum, which are all, the would-be Brexiteer MPs, thinking it's a good idea to pay into this. Well, oh no, it isn't, because if you pay in, then you're going to be part of military union. And it's goodbye Her Majesty's Armed Services, goodbye BAE, goodbye Rolls-Royce, goodbye Babcock, and everything else.
Yeah.
So the mitigation there is enormous. So I think we've got to drill out this thinking that it's a good idea to pay in. We've got to stop all this nonsense, that the mere reference of calling this thing what it is, military union, with these Tory MPs being shy and bashful about it, not being able to think out of their party political comfort zone and box. So we've got to get to grips with this. I'm very annoyed here with Jacob Rees-Mogg, very annoyed with him at all, because for him to say the EU needs us is sort of suggesting the source that we had at the number 10, the disastrous number 10 letter with David Cameron, putting all those senior officers' names on it without their consent to remain. The same source told me it was May, the Tory party's tactic to use the military and offer the military into military union as a bargaining chip to get the trade deal. Well, of course, that's a nonsense. That's completely inverse. I would suggest that she's been deluded, as the rest of the party, if that's the case, because obviously the only thing the EU wants is military union. It's not bothered about the rest of it. It's incidental. Yeah. This is the key bit. It'll give them their treasure. It'll give them the tax base. They're off and running. That's the important part. So the Tories are deluded. The Labour Party aren't talking about it and holding their feet to the fire. And the only thing that's been agreed so far in Brexit is PESCO. Now, PESCO is military union, and Britain is a member. It's a third-party member, but a member nonetheless.
Yeah. Okay, David, thank you for that. Let's follow on with some rather strange stuff that seems to be happening at the moment. Now, you and there were a few other people alerted to us to a thing called Tech Vets. We had no idea what this was. I went looking for it this morning, and the first thing I came up was this Twitter page from a very nice lady called Susie Dunn. But I was fascinated that there was only two tweets available on her Twitter page. A lot of T's there, Mike. And what was she saying? Well, we should look at the launch of Tech Vets. Very important. Look at the launch of Tech Vets. Now, what is this? Well, it's building on the strengths of veterans. This is the cyber security industry starting to look to recruit ex-military people. They've got links through here to the Veterans Digital Cyber Academy. But over the past 17 years, our soldiers, sailors and airmen have experienced one of the busiest and most complex operational chapters in military history. 15,000 trained and full-time service personnel have left. We're going to hoover them up into this cyber security. This is very weird stuff. particularly after this intent to put a V for veterans on driving licenses. I think these people are being round up, caught in a net almost. This is part of the launch program. I always suffer at this point because it's very small text. Let's see what we can do here. I've highlighted a few things. I found these two very interesting. Two of the speakers, Vicky Langston, Program Manager, Google DeepMind, Phil Kimpton, Penetration Tester. This is fascinating stuff. This is getting soldiers into that cyber industry. Then down here we've got General Sir Richard Barrons involved, so the military is pulled into the middle of this themselves. We've got this gentleman, Hans Pung, Rand Europe, we'll come on to him, Chairman of Forces in Mind. I found that very interesting, rather sinister name. And then down at the bottom we've got Admiral Sir George Zambellas, that I know you've come across before. So let's carry on through, and I'll come back to you for a reply, David. Here's George Zambellas himself. If you have a look on his LinkedIn page, he's into some very interesting stuff now. Pagefield Global Counsel, that appears to be a legal firm. Strategic Advisory Board of Liquid Robotics, and founder and chairman of Cobweb Cyber Limited. So he seems to have a connection into this cyber business as well. Founder and chairman of this organisation, Praxec. And of course, it then goes back to his career in the Royal Navy. So I'm sure these are all wonderful things, but it would be nice to know exactly what is going on now between the connections of senior ex-military people and the cyber industry.
It does seem like a conflict of interest that on one hand you've got the former military personnel ramping up the fear over cyber attacks and so on, while they've got personal interests in cyber companies.
Well, so I'm sure a lot of other people would ask this question, Mike, and perhaps we might get some answers in due course. Let's go on through it. Here's Forces in Mind. Now, this is all about charities to help ex-forces people establish themselves in the civilian world. This man, always great of interest to me. This is Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Boyce. So he's the patron. Then we've got some other senior people, Air Vice Marshals, General Sir John McCall, and Major General Martin Rutledge, and Melanie Waters, the Chief Executive. And let's bring in our RAND man. Here he is, Chairman of the Board, because RAND is just an incredible organisation. Sorry, a few funders there as well. If you want to know where the money comes from, it comes from the Royal Foundation, so British royalty. We've also got the Confederation of Service Charities and the National Lottery. It's a very interesting mix, isn't it? So what do we know about RAND? Well, let's bring in this bit. What this gentleman says about himself is President of RAND Europe, a not-for-profit public policy research organisations that helps improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis. Offices in Cambridge, Brussels. But of course, this is a vast American outfit, vast, with fingers in every possible pie in the American military and American security services. And now we're starting to find individuals buried with us. It goes on, practical hands-on cyber skills and development. People can freeze these pages to have a look. And I'll come full circle for you, David, because of course it was Veterans for Britain, Lee Rotherham, who said quite rightly that a nation state that contracts out its defence has ceased to be. So that was a pretty chilling warning. And it was your good self who pointed out there was a wall of silence by these politicians over EU military unification. It seems to me that they're trying to pull the serving military into Europe, and they are literally rounding up veterans, finding out who they are, tracking them over social media with Cambridge Analytica, for example. What are they going to do? Are they going to take military veterans out of the game?
It's a splendid question, Brian. Thank you very much. I mean, let's look at the principal factors here. We've got military as a big issue, whether that be British military at the moment or EU military. We've got veterans are clearly an issue. We've got digital and cyber being ramped up and escalated dramatically, both on a government level. Everybody must note that over the last couple of weeks, the government has made announcements of a cyber school and cyber warfare and extra funding. We're seeing money going into GCHQ, so on and so forth. So we see another leg of the state table with Rand backing. They're one of the big players in this. IBM are in there as well. And let's make no bones about it. Rand is right in the thick of American government. It was the consultancy company that brought in all of the nuclear fail-safe protocols and is now entrenched across all places in American government and British government, and now going into Europe. So what can we say to our veterans in this country? Well, what's going on with the veterans in this country? We've got a political party being formed and getting off the ground called Democrats and Veterans. They're looking to do at-source democracy with its members, so direct democracy. So hats off to them for that. They're out of the traps. They're setting up branches, and I can see them getting active and getting response. What they're talking about, most of it sounds very good to me, personally, my own opinion. And I don't doubt that they're going to find it very, very tough, because what they're trying to do is going to upset the Conservatives' apple cart. So we've got those guys on the one hand. So they're going to attract veterans into this because they're veterans themselves. And on the other hand, we've got this body being set up here, Tech Vets, and their pitch is to get veterans with digital and computing expertise and cyber expertise to come into them.
Yeah, come into their camp.
To come into their camp. So let's all be very, very clear about this, okay? At the high end of American and British government capabilities, once they have your email, they will be able to real-time model you in absolute form. Right? So that's the key thing. If you go in and subscribe with any of these groups and register with them, they will see your entire digital profile and be able to run a real-time model of you instantaneously, and those records will be kept. The NSA will keep them. It's a huge amount of capability that they've got. So if you're going to go along this, you need to consider very, very carefully what you are doing. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yep, David, we'll do some more on this, but we're putting out a warning here. I can pick up your warning. I certainly feel it as well. I think this is the state putting out a fishing net to identify, track and draw in veterans. And I think the reason for that is the state is very, very frightened of veterans who will wake up to what is actually going on with government policy.
If you're training people, giving them a job and paying them, of course they can't be busy politically.
Absolutely right. If you pay them, you're going to be, how does it work? The person who controls the purse string is in charge. Right.
Okay.
Quick advert.
Dying for Good Health, our NHS conference taking place at the Albert Hall in Nottingham on the 12th of May. Tickets available on the UK Column website. Get along to that if you can. AV9, you're speaking. Alex Thompson speaking, Patrick Henningsen speaking. Ian Crane's event taking place the 4th to the 7th of May in the Horwood House Hotel near Milton Keynes. Tickets are available at alternativeview.com. Now, just very briefly, as we get into the situation with Russia, I just want to put up 21st Century Wire's coverage of the latest on Russiagate, because the US House Intelligence Committee apparently has thrown in the towel on this. They've given up on it. It is clearly, they finally discovered that it isn't going to fly. After 14 months and who knows exactly how many millions spent in public money, the US House Intelligence Committee has finally admitted that it has found absolutely no evidence of collusion, coordination or conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russians. We didn't find any evidence of collusion, and I don't think Special Counsel Robert Mueller will either, said a US Representative Mike Conway, who's Republican from Texas. Well, they published an interim statement here. Trump tweeted out, the House Intelligence Committee has, after 14-month-long in-depth investigation, found no evidence of collusion or coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia to influence the 2016 presidential election. And that was it. So I'd say the British government not too happy about this because, of course, it was Christopher Steele and ex-British or allegedly ex-British intelligence operatives that pushed together the evidence against Trump. Let's not worry about that. Let's move on to our own Russiagate over here, which of course continues to grow in angst and so on. Well, Theresa May, after she made her statement in the House of Commons, made some phone calls. The first one was to Donald Trump. This was yesterday. She spoke to him to update him on the ongoing investigation into the Salisbury incident, and she set out the conclusions reached by the UK government that it was highly likely that Russia was responsible for the attack against the Skripals. Trump's response, allegedly, I don't know that this is for sure, but allegedly his response was, yeah, right. In the meantime, Boris Johnson was busy as well. He was speaking to French Foreign Minister Le Drian, and Le Drian offered France's total solidarity for this unacceptable act. He spoke to German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel, and he emphasised how countering Russian disinformation was the most important thing to be involved in. He spoke to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and Stoltenberg said the government the importance of NATO standing together. Well, did they? Well, let's get to this because at least one source in NATO told TASS that in fact using Article 5, which of course is the all for one, one for all article, would be disproportionate response to such an incident. Getting support from all allies would be impossible. With a high degree of probability, one should expect the NATO Council will hold security consultations under Article 4 of the Washington Treaty on Collective Defence. Well, NATO in fact released a statement this morning. They said the UK briefed the North Atlantic Council today on the use of nerve gas in Salisbury on the 4th of March. The UK confirmed the use of a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia and briefed allies that it was highly likely that Russia was responsible. The UK also confirmed that this was an indiscriminate and reckless attack against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk. Allies expressed deep concern at the first offensive use of nerve agent on alliance territory since NATO's foundation. Allies expressed solidarity with the UK, offered their support in the conduct of the ongoing investigation and called on Russia to address the UK's questions, including providing full and complete disclosure of the Novichok programme to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Allies agreed that the attack was a clear breach of international norms and agreements, and so it went on. And in the meantime, Britain has been whining to the OPCW, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and they called. This was a statement by Peter Wilson, permanent representative for the UK to the OPCW, who said that really he was disgusted that Russia had behaved in such a way and so on. I'm not even going to bother reading most of this out. The UK is now called for an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council to discuss this situation, and that's going to take place this evening. Vanessa, I think before we came on air, Theresa May hadn't made her statement, but I think you heard something just as we were coming on air on this.
Yeah, it's just actually broken on Twitter just now in the last 10 minutes. The 23 Russian diplomats have been expelled from the UK, and Theresa May has broken off bilateral relationships with Russia. So the insanity, and it is insanity, continues. Also just breaking is the fact that Israeli media is making a very clear statement that the fall for them, the liberation for the Syrians of Eastern Ghouta, is a disaster for their campaign in Syria. So they're now even coming entirely 100% out into the open, which is what we've been talking about through the last 5 years. Every time that Eastern Ghouta is put under pressure, Israel has bombed the airbase on the other side of Damascus in Mezeh. So, we're seeing, I think what we're seeing, actually, what we appear to be seeing now is a showing of hands. And to some extent, it's actually a relief. I mean, we've been talking about the fact that Eastern Ghouta is incredibly important to the US coalition. Now we're seeing how important. They're prepared to break off bilateral relationships with Russia. they're prepared to run with what is an utterly ridiculous claim, just as they have done with the chemical weapon attacks. They're expelling diplomats. The Russian embassy in the UK is putting out a tweet thanking people for their supportive messages, although they're saying they're receiving some hateful messages as well. So we're seeing a serious escalation here, which is, it's bringing us to the brink of all-out conflict in Syria, from what I can understand.
So let's just let's bring this on, because SyriaPropagandaMedia.org is the website to go for this. This is the working group on Syria, propaganda and media, and it's entitled Doubts About Novichok's. And it says the following briefing note is developed from ongoing research and investigation into the use of chemical and biological weapons during the 2011 to present war in Syria, conducted by members of the Working Group on Syria, Media and Propaganda. The authors are Professor Paul McKeague and Professor Piers Robinson. It says in the House of Commons on 12th of March, the Prime Minister stated that it is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. It's part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok and so on. The Prime Minister, they say, said that if no credible response by the end of Tuesday, the UK would conclude that there had been unlawful use of force by Moscow. And they give a summary of key issues that need to be addressed. The first one is there are reasons to doubt that these compounds are military-grade nerve agents, or that a Russian Novichok program ever existed. If they were potentially usable as chemical weapons, people on the OPCW Scientific Advisory Board who were in a position to know the properties of these compounds would have recommended that they be added to the list of scheduled chemicals. They have never been added. And secondly, synthesis at bench scale of organic chemicals, such as the purported Novichoks, is within the capability of a modern chemistry laboratory. Portendown itself must have been able to synthesize these compounds in order to develop tests for them. The detection of such a compound does not establish Russian origin. The original source, they say, for the story of a new class of organophosphate compounds was developed as chemical weapons under the name Novichok in the Soviet Union during the 70s and 80s is from Vail Mirzhanov, a defector in the 1990s. However, Mirzhanov originally claimed that the Novichok agents were easy to synthesize. One should be mindful that the chemical components or precursors of A232 or its binary version Novichok 5 are ordinary organophosphates that can be made at commercial chemical companies that manufacture such products as fertilizers and pesticides. So that's a pretty clear statement from these two professors, one of which will be speaking at the Media on Trial event in May. But what are your thoughts on this, Vanessa? Just briefly, please.
Well, I mean, I think, I think what they're doing is to try and break this hysteria, this mounting hysteria that, of course, is being supported by the media in Britain, and to try and bring it back down to earth. But what we're seeing effectively now is preparation. It looks very much like preparation for war. The expulsion of diplomats, the possible threat to RT, so to the media. I don't know if David agrees with this, but this looks very much to me as if they're preparing for making the conflict official in Syria.
Okay. David, let's just ask you, do you have any brief thoughts on this, just briefly?
Yeah, I do. We've been looking at this closely for a couple of days. I've taken quite a lot of cross-spectrum opinion on it, and the conclusions that we've got here is this is when May started issuing ultimatums, they sounded very much like Neville Chamberlain's ultimatums to Hitler in World War II. I think, as both Vanessa and I have said previously, that this Syrian thing is being used to provide the table and framework for this greater and further military unification in Europe. In terms of the specifics of this, it's very much like a kind of Frederick Forsyth Fourth Protocol type analogy, because whilst you couldn't let a nuclear bomb off on someone else's soil, this sort of thing, one way or the other, is a great pretext. And what we're seeing now is pretext to war. Let's let nobody be under any misapprehension of this. Expelling diplomats, breaking off bilateral relations with another state and so on and so forth is a pretext to war, if this isn't dealt with very quickly in Parliament with some sense and sensibility, we could very, very quickly find the entire Western Partnership being broken. NATO is probably going to collapse during this process, and what will come through will be EU military union, and that obviously is the big cheese. It's what's being desired, and I find it ironic that that today, stroke yesterday, we're seeing Jacob Rees-Mogg and one or two others come out in the Express and making these comments. I've got to come back to one thing, and I'll close with this. Quite some time ago, Brian and I did some work where we looked at the Sajiv David gaffe in the Navy Club in Berkeley Square, and we went into RUSI and had a good look at RUSI and drilled it out. We found one of their directors and advisors in there called Professor Malcolm Chalmers, and he wrote a book called A Little Is a Lot, and we're seeing some of this terminology coming out now in these comments from the other RUSI analyst. What was her name? Doctor? Just prompt me. Doctor, what's her name?
I'm afraid I can't help you on that one, David.
Okay, she's just made these comments where the Express have been printing, and what we're seeing is this little is a lot, and Britain now cannot defend itself, and people saying, we need Europe, Europe needs us, and so on and so forth. What they're doing here is talking the talk of unification.
Yeah.
So, let's sort of stand back and look at the scene as a whole here. And I think, Vanessa, I'm going to agree with you. I'm seeing pretext to war, and I'm seeing somebody, using this sort of breach of fourth protocol on someone else's soil in order to do it.
Yeah.
And it's abhorrent, under the circumstances. It is utterly abhorrent that anybody in this country could consider going to the war, considering the condition our military is in and the nation is in.
Yep.
Just no.
Okay.
I've got to bring this one in. I know the time's running, Mike, but let's just look at this headline here. Express: Putin poisoning plan backfires as world readies to wage World War III on Russia. No evidence on the table at all that the Russians did it. Certainly no evidence that Putin did it, unless he flew across here with a suitcase. And yet we're now talking about World War III. Well, I'll skip over this next one, but I'll just bring it up on screen quickly. The BBC has sent a team to Russia to find out how he treats the opposition. We'll show this little clip in the next couple of days. Just outrageous propaganda by the BBC. We've got Amber Rudd here sending out letters to other MPs talking about the fact that they're decontaminating. Now, let's remember, it's 10 days after the incident. What have we got? We've got men in their funny little suits, 10 days after the incident, supposedly screening off ticket machines. Yeah. This is complete nonsense, absolute nonsense. This is not real. Look at this headline, Devon Live. Britain is under attack by Russia, says Devon MP. Well, no, he didn't, because if you look at the sub-headline, it said under attack from another state. And here's the man, Johnny Mercer. I think I've just seen, and I look at my honourable friends opposite as I say this, the most shameful moment in the House of Commons in my time to date. Somebody dared criticise the Prime Minister. But look at his true words. It's clear this sovereign United Kingdom has come under attack from another state. So that was a completely misleading headline. And then we have this gentleman who says that he's calling for the United Nations to get involved. And he says, I'm not holding my breath for an answer. As for their accusations that this is all some dastardly UK plot, I think they, Russia, have been reading too much Jean Le Carré. Well, I'm just going to show on screen this book to our audience today. It's called Britain's Secret Wars. It's by a gentleman called T.J. Coles. And you can read in here the dirty dealings of the British government over many years, killing, maiming, starting wars for their benefit, certainly not for ours. We better end there, Mike, I think.
Well, just 30 seconds, Vanessa.
No, just very quickly, would people cast their minds back to the images from Han Shahun chemical attacks of the white helmets in flip-flops and T-shirts? and then look again at the British investigation of the alleged Russian chemical weapon attack and the hazmat suits and so on that they're wearing.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you.
Okay, David, thank you as well. We'll end there. Thank you very much to our audience for joining us today. What a state of affairs in UK today as the British government takes over £3 million from Russians in London, the so-called oligarchs. Very few checks on their backgrounds and allegiances, and then the same Conservative government stands on a world stage and blames Putin and the Russian people for an act with no evidence on the table whatsoever. So there it is, UK rapidly approaching a dictatorship. Can we do something about it? We must speak out, spread the information, and above all, we need to protect the alternative media. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.